I think we increasingly use stress as an umbrella term for a lot of things to find one another.
Welcome to the Stress Navigation Podcast. In this podcast, we'll talk about stress, science, and daily life. We'll interview experts in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, physiology, genetics, sociology, data analysis, and much more. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Stress Navigation. Today, we are with a very interesting person, Bertus Jeronimus. And as you may know, stress is the main topic of this podcast. And we've talked about how it relates to mental health, to cardiometabolic health, and even about how technology can be used to measure it. However, we haven't really defined it yet. Even though we intuitively somehow know what it means and how it can affect us, some say stress is a vague term that maybe isn't very useful because there's just so many ways of understanding it. It's so personal. Others say it's complex and requires proper dissection. I personally lean more towards the latter. So in today's episode, we will be speaking with Bertus, an associate professor at the University of Groningen, who is part of a team that is developing a comprehensive theory of daily life stress. A clinical and developmental psychologist, he brings together knowledge about personality, about life experiences, context, and even the evolution of the stress system. I think Bertus is a super cool guy, and I'm very happy to be talking with him. Hi, Bertus. Thanks for being here. How's it going?
Thank you. Well, what an introduction. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here.
That's good. Well, let's just get right into it. Like I mentioned, stress is something that we all feel, but there are many ways of understanding it, and some say it's a bit of a vague term. So considering what I just said, is it problematic that the term stress is a bit vague? And if so, why?
Yeah, well, I completely agree with that. It's a complex and a relatively vague term. And that is because people try to envelope a lot of stuff in the word stress. So if you have this kind of permissive classification, it has very low utility to predict and to study. So I'm in favor of really precise formulation. I think that makes stuff scientific. And I also learned to appreciate this when I studied law. So I really see why this ambiguity is crucial. But it also helps us much better to help people who struggle with stress, because as you know, it's the globally leading cause of disease and of lost productivity. And it leads to a lot of low well-being in people, unhappiness. So yeah, we should actually work on that because it's actually the primary problem in our modern world.
Yeah, well, I think the World Health Organization has said that, right? That stress-related diseases are the biggest burden on global healthcare. So
true, but also if you ask adults in general, like how stressed are you, then 1 in 3 scores 8 or higher on a scale from 1 to 10. So you would say extreme stress in almost a third of the people. That's
I guess that answers my next question. But why is it important to make a theory of stress? Because I guess by understanding it better, we hope to be able to treat it better.
Yes, it's as easy as that.
But is it even possible, considering that it can mean something so different for so many people?
That depends on the day. So on some days I'm deeply cynical and I don't think we will end up somewhere. On other days I'm much more optimistic for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons, which I also use for my first year students to make them see it a bit in perspective, is that even a phenomenon like a correlation, we only have that for 120 years. Like it's 3 or 4 generations, we actually beyond the states of proto-science. So science just barely started to unfold the wings. So what do we expect in 2025?
That's a good point. And that's the whole other topic, like the history of science and the history of theories, and also how theories in the past may not be true today. And then in 200 years, what we think about today
might not be true
later.
I think especially psychology has been for 2,000 years in a stasis since the time of the old Greeks until the late 1800s. So there happened a lot, but basically the discussions, etc., were comparable.
Yeah, it's true. I sometimes, I also study philosophy and I read Aristotle, and I feel like the things that are being said 2,000 years ago are very similar to today.
Yeah, but the crucial difference is that we have a statistical enlightenment. So now we can calculate stuff. And we thought about measurement, which the ancient Greeks lacked. And that's a fundamental difference between what we're doing in the past 200-300 years versus what happened before.
Okay, so I definitely want to get back to that because we have some questions about theory and about history and about measurement. But I guess to kick off how the theory is looking like now, I went on the streets and I just asked someone about what they thought stress is. And I wanted to play it to you and then compare, see how close this person is hitting the mark, or or what their experience is in comparison to more the academic way of understanding stress. So here is Benjamin on stress. Yeah, so Benjamin, how will you define stress?
Stress, when I think about it, is pressure. It's the feeling of pressure, and it can come from any sort of angle, any sort of stressor. It can be internal pressure that you're applying to yourself. It can feel like external pressure from, society or financial stress or other people applying pressure to you, whether intentionally or not. But yeah, when I think about stress, I just think about it's a pressure that is trying to make you do or feel a certain way.
That's a great answer. Thank you. Nice. So what do you think about this person's take on stress?
Yeah, I think he mentioned something that a lot of people would agree with. I find two things interesting about it. The first is that a lot of people talk about pressure with the idea implicit that we will fall back to the state before, right? So you respond
you weren't
to stress.
Under pressure? And
yes, and then you will, like as a ball, return to your shape. I would call it more demands for the reason that as a developmental psychologist, you do not expect people to return to the position they were before, but to change course, for example, in response to stress. So I would say I don't think there's a consensus definition, but if you would create one on the spot, I would agree with what Benjamin said. So it's an internal, external demand, and that taxes or exceeds the capacity of an individual, but it can also be a social system or a tissue system. So they each respond to stress. And since last century, let's say a year or 70, people have a more of transactional next step in which they say how the system thinks about the stress, that the pressure, in the words of Benjamin, plays a crucial role. So this is done, Lazarus, for example, where they say appraisal makes a big difference. How controllable do you think the stressor is? How well are you able to cope with it? And that's true for the individual, so that creates a lot of individual differences in how we respond to similar kind of events. But that's, of course, also true for a social system or a tissue system, like what does the body expect will happen? With experience, we update our expectations, and then something that previously was stressful, so we didn't have a proper anticipatory response, so we didn't see it coming, so the body has to, on the spot, respond to something. That's stressful because it doesn't have a proper strategy. Once you see it coming, you can create all kinds of strategies. And so to make this very concrete, if you have a traffic jam, for some people this is stressful. Other people think, relaxed, I don't have to go anywhere, so I have a couple of moments for myself. So that's the appraisal difference. But if the traffic jam is there every morning, you create all kinds of strategies to make use of that time. For example, practice languages, brush your teeth, I don't know what else. But then it's not as stressful anymore because you knew the traffic jam would be coming. So you make sure that you leave on time, for example. So similar type of events can be stressful or not stressful, depending on how much control you experience, but also how you think about what happens. So for example, I don't like meetings very much in general. But then I had a mentor who taught me to think about it as rituals, so something that has to happen, and it doesn't matter very much what happens within the meeting per se, but the fact that we have this
People
together.
Come together.
Yes, and that's actually the crucial part, made them completely not stressful for me anymore compared to the previous situation. So how you think about how you spend that hour, for example, fundamentally changes how you experience something like that.
So that's interesting. That would be an add-on to what Benjamin said. He talks about the feeling of pressure, internal, external, that leads the body, yourself, to either do something or feel a certain way, but then how you interpret an event is also key to the theory of stress that you're working on.
Yeah, that's crucial.
But then so many people, what does this appraisal depend on? How one interprets it? I can imagine.
That's depending on your current state, on your finances, experience, knowledge, all these kinds of things. So a lot of cognitive, but also physiological dimensions, like how much energy you have, these kind of things. But what makes it so difficult to talk about, something like stress in this context, is that it means so many different things. So when we use the word stress, we can mean the stimulus, we can mean the experience, so what's the stressor and how do we think about this stressor, for example? Then how do we respond, which has a physiological element like a heart rate, all these kind of things, sweating, energy for the muscles. But there's also a lot of psychological stuff going on, like I cannot handle this, or if I manage, then I'm cool and over time I will master it, etc. So more as an opportunity. And then this response can be short-term, so you have an immediate peak, but there's also a recovery period, and you have, of course, a long-term effect of stress. We also call that stress, and then we talk, for example, about stress disorders or somatic health problems. So even the stress effect is called stress. So we have a lot of different stuff that we all label stress, and I don't think that's definitely not helpful, because it can be mild stressors.
Yeah.
So things that daily hassles, lost your keys, commuting. Well, we discussed all these kind of things, but can also be much more serious, like you lose your partner, have a car accident.
The severity of the
yes,
stressor.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and we all call it stress. So it can be very minor, but can also be something that's life-changing and affecting your next couple of decades, right? So it's really, in that sense, wild how much we try to capture with the word stress.
So sometimes I guess scientists really like to define things, and in that sense, each word might get their own way of being explained. Do you think the word stress in this general way, we can still use it, and then as long as if you make sure to distinguish everything, or would you call each of these things something different that isn't stress? Like, for example, daily hassle, would you keep calling it stress? Or would you just try to say, okay, let's just call it daily hassles, and that's it?
I think we increasingly use stress as an umbrella term for a lot of things to find one another, whereas we all mean something different. And what you will hear in this podcast, of course, is that the different experts that you invite, who have their different expertise and perspective on the matter, approach stress very differently. So, a very straightforward example is you have people who approach it from more of an emotional stance, like I would do, stress as an emotion and an emotional response. But people in a clinic would talk more about stress disorders, and we'll have a completely different approach and language to converse about it. And the people who study the hormones, etc., approach it completely different, right? This is this discussion where we perhaps should not go into, but sports, which is a pleasurable activity, some people would say this is stress because physiologically speaking, it's completely comparable to a stress reaction, right? Heart rate, hormones, all these kind of things. But we would call it relaxation, right? Because we sport to take a break and unwind. Exactly. So, then the psychologists are speaking. That are completely different approach. And you also see that's not fitting always. So
that's true. Then I'm thinking, for someone who's just listening and wants to know, okay, what are the elements? I'm noticing now that we're talking about, okay, there's a bodily experience of stress, things that are happening in your body. There's maybe something more emotional in your mind that is happening. There's the stressor itself, the thing that causes a stress response, and then there's the recovery from the stress. It's important to think about how long a stressor is lasting. So things that happen just on a daily basis, maybe once, or things that are happening on a daily basis for many weeks or years, how severe it is, and then, of course, how one can control it or how one appraises it. So maybe just for the listeners, I've said a couple things, but in case you're thinking about stress, maybe these are some elements to consider when reflecting on stress in your own life. But then I have a question, which is it different to talk about a theory of stress in general, or to talk about a theory of daily life stress, which is what we're doing is stress in action?
Yes, well, I think an ideal theory of stress captures all the different levels. And that's something that's widely outside of our reach. So in that sense, it's imaginary for now.
Yeah.
But that's what we're working on within stress in action.
So break down the levels for me?
Well, I agree with you. You have, of course, a physiological and a psychological level, and they might align, but not necessarily so. So some people, for example, don't have insight in their physiological stress. So they typically work together.
Like your body is wound up, but you don't realize until the end of the day that you've been cramping your fists, for instance, or grinding your teeth.
For example. And a lot of people will recognize this, that when they're exercising or when they are winding down, let's say a holiday or weekend, that they finally feel how stressed they actually were or are, etc. And then we talk also about stuff like homeostasis and these kind of processes. So that's the level of theory we would then apply. I would come in, I guess, more from an emotion theory perspective, and then we would say stress is simply something like physiological arousal. So how activated your body is to handle things inside yourself or in your physical environment. You can talk about it more over weeks, like moods or mood disorders, stress disorders like anxiety, depression, burnout. These kind of topics are part of this podcast. They're covered by a lot of experts within stress and action. And you can think about individuals which are much more vulnerable for stress. A vulnerability for stress is a personality trait that is captured by the neuroticism domain. And so personality is another level. And these time scales which go from mere seconds, so the immediate stress response, panic reaction, then recovery, then typically within 72 hours, that stress response is over. So that's an acute stress reaction, and you recover from this. But of course, stress can accumulate over time, and you have wear and tear, you can break down. That's then more the domain of somatic disorders, stress disorders, and lifespan trajectories. And I find these very interesting as a developmental psychologist. For example, that when children are born or grow, that there are different periods of vulnerability. So, for example, children before age 5 sample a lot of unpredictability and stress in the environment to calibrate their body and their mind, so the phenotype to handle the world.
So they're just testing out things to see how the world behaves.
Yes, on a very basic level already when you are growing in the womb, for example, they sample the blood from the mother to see how much stress hormones are there. If there's a lot of stress hormones, probably the world is dangerous or unpredictable, uncontrollable. So you try to develop a system, a body, a phenotype that can handle an unpredictable and more dangerous world. And if there are not stress hormones in the body of the mother, then you think, so there are a lot of resources, stuff is safe, then I can better develop a body that can handle an environment like that optimally. So we try to calibrate our system, and already, before we are born, this is definitely happening. And then in the first 5 years of life, we sample a lot. So that's why childhood abuse and neglect, for example, has such profound impact over the lifespan. And then later on, it's much more difficult to change course. And then you can get into the interesting phenomenon that people who have been formed, shaped to handle very stressful environments, but get a lot of good education or resources or what else available. So they live actually in a very safe and quiet and controllable environment. So you would say that's ideal, but they can still feel a lot of stress because actually there's a mismatch between how they are programmed and the world in which they live. And you can even have strange stuff like power stress, so people who need to exercise power over people but don't have anybody to be bossy over, they can actually get ill from that because they need to fulfill this need for power, for example. So stress can also be a lot of different things, and you have specific needs.
And I find it fascinating that it starts in the womb, because it's a whole developmental thing, and then we start thinking about it when we're maybe teenagers or maybe adults, maybe people even later in their adulthood. And then what do? You've been shaped your whole life very critically in your first periods of life. And then what happens? Can you actually change your behavior? What's your experience in that? Can people find ways to reappraise their life successfully, to think about things differently? Or is it kind of tough once you've already been shaped in a way?
Well, there's always space for development. So this idea that we're fixed once we reach adulthood, that's an old-fashioned idea. So since the 1980s, people let that go. So of course, there's constraints like your genetics and the social world in which you live, and you can change that. But there's always a bandwidth of change possible. So a lot of people want to change their personality, for example. And severe personality changes are absolutely possible, for example, with therapy, with medication, but also by choosing different environments, experiences, and partners, for example, which is a really fundamental choice for how your life unfolds. So if you, for example, had a rough childhood and you're programmed to be very sensitive and vulnerable to stress, and you find a partner who is extremely stable, and somebody like that can really help you cope with these kind of experiences. So then that's a good choice.
Yeah, in here I'm really thinking about the role of context and the people around you in maybe learning to reappraise the things that happen in your life. And I also find it, kind of challenging to the fact that maybe it's so hard to actually change your environment or change your context, because if you're stuck in your day-to-day, and maybe your day-to-day is really stressful, maybe you're not in a financial position to change things, then what's the solution? Is the solution to, maybe in our case, if stress and action, stick a wearable on someone and monitor them? Or how can that actually change?
Well, the solution can be, of course, via therapy, that you influence the appraisal system. So you can teach people to not have negative interpretations of everything around them, for example, or to think differently about the ways to handle things and coping. But the solutions can also be very practical. So, for example, I did once a study together with some people from the United States, in which we studied people on daily level how stressed they were depending on when they have their paycheck. So in the United States, it's typically bi-weekly. So then you have days in which you have a lot of money available because the paycheck just came in. And of course, in the days before the paycheck is given, they have least money available because the majority of people live paycheck to paycheck. And what you then see is that in the days before you get your paycheck, a lot of things are more stressful because you don't have money to solve it. So for example, when it rains, you can call a cab if you have money. When you have leakage in your house, you can let it fix if you have money, etc., etc. And if the money is not available, of course, then we get stressed. And of course, you can, I know it's more easy to say than do, but can teach people to plan and make sure that the money is stable over over the month. And then you don't have these waves in stress anymore.
Levels. Well, how do you think the way society works, at least, I can't talk about the whole world, but at least in the Western world, maybe in the Netherlands, if we want to be a bit more specific, to not generalize, how do you think that influences our understanding of stress and your theory of stress, considering it is so influenced also by the environment?
That's a very deep and broad question, and I think I will use some practical examples to explain this. Of course, we study daily life stresses, so then we should look at what happens in people's daily lives. These are typically recurrent challenges, for example, daycare. I have small children, so I bring them to school in the morning or to childcare, and then at 8:30 they are both at school, and they're fed and they have clean clothing, etc. I already experience that as an achievement every morning. So you see that these kind of hassles, that are stresses that are recurrent in our daily life, and not that important because we can handle them, but it remains stressful. Context is really important because it influences how stressful something is. So, for example, we in the Netherlands are very much fixated on being on time. So if you then, you don't manage to be on time, that's really stressful. But also, there are some paradoxes. So we have a welfare state. So what you then get is during the pandemic, you saw that in the Netherlands, people were not so stressed and anxious and depressed as in a lot of other Western countries, because we have a government and we trust the government will take care of us. So essentially, we're taken care of. And that really has an effect on the whole population. At the same time, you see that we also have more burnout and all these kind of things because we have a welfare state that takes care of us when we don't manage. So it's very paradoxical. So on one hand, it takes away a lot of stress for us, but at the same time, it allows us to experience particular things. And this is just like one example to show how complex and...
Well, what I'm getting is that you can't really separate what stress is, the experience of stress, with how the world around you works. And that, of course, that's very broad. You can say whether your government system, how that influences how you manage stress or what help you get, or your social context, everything. It's very broad.
Yes.
But then it also makes me think of the history of the term, because now we live in this moment and this is how we understand stress. Do you know a little bit about when the term started being used as it is now, or if it's changed throughout different historical periods?
Yes, definitely. And of course, this is again a very broad question, but I will pick two examples which I think are very important. And the first one is very old. So we had this Roman orator Cicero, and Cicero had a daughter, Tullia, and Tullia gave birth to a child and died while doing so. And then Cicero went into a period of very deep grief, what we nowadays would call depression. And then he realized that this episode is completely different from people who are always negative or stressed, or he said, like, in this state of stress, I'm completely outside of my normal way of doing things. So that's the first moment in time, 2,500 years ago, where we separate an episode of stress, an episode of anxiety, depression, from people who are generally stressed. So that's, I think, a first crucial distinction.
Yeah.
And then we go to a very recent period of time, so crudely the 1920s, when Hans Selye is a very famous doctor, neurologist. In this case, he wanted to be what we would call a general practitioner kind of person, neurologist, who was studying a lot of people in a hospital in Prague, where he was doing his studies, who came in with all kinds of diseases, and he had to diagnose them. So fever, flu, allergic reactions, ulcers, whatever these people had. And he realized that actually a lot of these people had symptoms that really resembled one another. So he said, well, we are searching for what distinguishes these people so we can diagnose them. But actually what strikes me is how much the first symptoms resemble one another. And later on, he started to call this a syndrome of being sick. So that was in 1925. And in 1936, he made a publication in Nature, which became really famous, in which he defined the stress syndrome, or a syndrome of being sick. And that can be elicited by a lot of different noxious inputs. So you can have pain, or you can have something taken away from you, or doesn't matter. There are a lot of different things that can elicit the same kind of response. So the body obviously has a system that handles things that are unpredictable, that are dangerous, that are threatening, uncontrollable. And we respond with a stress syndrome. And that's actually the origin of this thinking about stress, in which stress is both the cause and the effect. So it's not really helpful in that sense. But it was such a virulent idea that it really dominated the last century. And that goes as far as that stress is a word even Japanese people know, whereas there are not many other Western words that are in these kind of languages.
Well, it's funny because even though it's it's vague, or maybe the cause and effect, or it's maybe confusing. At the same time, it captures this idea of the syndrome of being sick sounds so general, but at the same time, it is, because it's so general, it makes sense to so many people. And I find that interesting. But then what things would you say that from old theories or maybe recent theories that, okay, this doesn't make sense, I'm going to discard it? Something that someone said that is like, today we don't treat that way at all.
Well, yeah, of course, Freud had an enormous impact on thinking. So dominate the first DSM, so the medical handbooks of psychiatry. And in the first DSM, 1950, stress was really seen as a reaction to something that happened to you. And then we had all this Freudian thinking, and yeah, that's completely discarded for symptom checklists, where we are now. So there you see that we can really make like a revolution in thinking. Because before that, everything was stress, neurosis, psychoneurosis. So for Freud, stress just captured most of mental health problems, but he just labeled it as a neurosis. So the nerves, a reaction of the nerves, you're too stressed, too sensitive.
And we don't use that anymore, that way of understanding.
Well, we use the labels, but we don't use this way of understanding things anymore, no.
Well, I would say that I do feel that now very generally people still think like, when they say, I'm feeling a bit whatever, a bit off, it's just so easy to say, well, it just might be stress. So yes. Maybe it's still in our lay way of thinking.
Definitely. Well, in this kind of thinking, you're taking over by spirits or dark moods, combinations of, there's something wrong in your body and you respond temporarily off. Whereas we nowadays would think about stress as very adaptive. So we would more think about optimum levels of stress. So in order to develop properly as a child or as a human being, you need exposure to stress to develop capacities, coping capacities, the systems to think and handle your environment. So if you take stress away from everyone, you will really get dysfunctional human beings.
Okay, is a key aspect of the theory then that the function of stress is adaptive.
Definitely, yes. And we have a dose-response relationship with stress. So the less stress, the more problematic it becomes, but also the more stress, the more problematic it becomes. And we each have an individual optimal range, a Goldilocks zone of stress that we can handle. And if we have too little, we get bored, or we can even become ill because we have too little stimulation. If you have algae or even animals and they get too little stimulation, then they die. But if you have too much, then we also die because it's too stressful, it takes too much energy, our body cannot cope anymore.
I guess that's where I see the whole society idea a bit problematic, because we kind of are all meant to follow a similar path, right? And like the schooling is the same way, and then we're meant to get into the work world. But there's so many individual differences on where that Goldilocks zone is. Then, yeah, I don't know what an ideal, I don't have solutions for that. But then it's hard for people to find their optimal zone of how much stress do I need.
Yes, and there are two important things to say about it. And the first one is that society has different demands on you depending on where you are in the life cycle. So children, adolescents can show all kinds of behaviors that are not acceptable anymore once you're an adult. Emerging adulthood is a period where you have to find your partner, you have to complete your education, you have to fit in society, find a job, an identity that fits you, and all these kind of things. And that results in a lot of contextual pressures. And that's also one of the reasons why you see most stress disorders flare up in late adolescence and early adulthood. But also we show a lot of individual development over the lifespan that's quite predictable. And what that means is that neuroticism as a personality trait, how sensitive you are and how vulnerable you are to stress and contextual demands, goes down rapidly. So what you see is that in our early 20s, we're also much more sensitive to contextual demands than later in adulthood. So from midlife onwards, you're much more emotionally stable. You're not as responsive anymore, in part because you learn so much about the world that stuff becomes much more predictable and controllable. You have resources, you have skills, you have knowledge. But also because you're not responding as much anymore to your context because you have different developmental tasks. So you don't need to fight in to find a partner, for example, or to fight yourself into a system to work. So both the people who can handle stress less well are also exposed to most stress, which is a very cruel element of the universe. And that's also true for people who are most sensitive to stress in terms of personality, etc. Also the people who are exposed most to stress, which is not an accident. For example, poor people, people in dangerous environments, etc. So
it's a vicious cycle.
You're doubly cursed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you're mentioning personality now. So of course you're a big personality researcher. And I'm curious about more explicitly how personality and stress are connected. You mentioned neuroticism. So can stress, and this, I'm getting the idea that stress can shape a personality, but also personality helps you perceive stress in a certain way. What would you say about this relationship between personality and stress?
Yeah, very complex.
Of course.
Exactly like you say.
Always.
So yes, it influences the kind of experiences you have. So people who are more outgoing will be more in social environments, etc. People who are more sensitive socially will have more fights and these kind of things. It influences aspects of the environment your attention goes. So some people notice things and are stressed over that, whereas other people not even register what's happening. It influences what kind of emotions are common to you or typically for you to experience. So people indeed who are...
So someone who is more open experiences things differently than someone who's more neurotic. What are the emotions that are associated?
Yes, well, there are 5 personality domains which are really crucial. So neuroticism, extraversion, conscientiousness, openness to new experiences, and agreeableness. And they each have a relationship with stress. But neuroticism is actually the backbone of personality in that regard, because it captures most individual differences in how sensitive we are to the environment. I would say actually how sensitive our neurosystem is to input from the outside. So how easily the stress system gets activated. So, but openness, an example you take. So people who score high on openness are very interested in new ideas, theories, stories, these kind of things, abstract stuff. If they cannot satisfy this need for finding new information or their curiosity, they get stressed. Mm-hmm. So you will see that depending on your personality, different things will elicit stress in you. So people who are highly neurotic, they need to have safety, etc., because a lot of things will elicit stress. Whereas people who score very low on that, they will not respond to most things normal people find stressful, which actually brings them in danger. So they die much more often from accidents because they take much more risks, etc. Mm-hmm. So there you also see that stress is typically very protective. And also in society, there's an optimal range of each personality trait which fits what society expects from you, but also which fits with the dangers we are exposed to.
So would you say that based on your personality type, you could kind of get a sort of guideline on how to manage stress throughout your life?
Yes, we will experience stress on different things. So for example, people who are very agreeable, so very much focused on social relationships, for them, social stress is even more stressful than for us in general. So we're a social species, so social stress is generally speaking one of the the strongest domains of stress. Losing a partner, getting into prison, losing a friend, these kind of things. But for them, this is even much more stressful than a lot of other events. So depending on your outlook on the world, different things will be stressful to you, and you will even have differences in stress response. And a very agreeable person will handle their stress by going to other people, talk with them about it, meet up with friends and family. Whereas people who score very low in agreeableness will, for example, go exercise to handle their stress or find different solutions. So it even influences what your next logic coping step would be.
Yeah, where did you start noticing this in yourself? Because you studied clinical and developmental psychology, and I guess that influenced how you have an outlook on life. What personality type would you say you are, and what are your kind of guidelines to work with stress?
Well, I score extremely high on openness, so that's something that stands out for my profile. For the rest, it's quite average. And I think that fits clearly with an academic career, which you have the opportunity to discover and learn a lot and exchange ideas with people. And I'm also relatively stable. So that fits then more in with, for example, management positions or these kind of tasks.
I find it interesting that things that for people is like discovery through life, then you look back on it, it's kind of predictable depending on your personality type.
Yeah, definitely. Yes. But of course, personality also follows from early life experiences in part. So if you have been abused or neglected a lot in childhood, you'll be programmed to be different in social contact. So some children are much more open in social contact, right? And that's a sign, like they don't have boundaries. Whereas other children will be afraid of strangers, which is a very logic response in this kind of context. And then you will be much more self-conscious, inhibited, etc. as an adult. So it also influences experiences of stress, how you in your lifespan respond to the world and to other people. Yeah,
I would just then say, take the time to learn about yourself to then know how to better appraise stress.
Definitely. And in that sense, what makes you stressed? So from my perspective, you experience emotions in what we call stress. And for some people, stress captures everything like anger and sadness. And other people have a much more refined vocabulary to talk about what they experience. But it's also a window into your soul. So what really matters for you or what's in this situation is really important, because you respond with stress to something, well, as I already said, you cannot control and you cannot predict, but also stuff that really threatens your well-being and your fitness in a way. And it should make you think, why are we responding like this? So why do I feel so threatened? And then you can also prevent this or work on indeed skills to handle specific things. So for me, running works really well. So I'm an enthusiastic runner. If I cannot run because I would be, I have a physical problem, then that coping mechanism is gone for me. And I immediately recognize that I get more stressed. So, you see, so I make that part of my routine. And that's for me a way to handle, well, the pressures you experience in daily life, which might be a bit more than is healthy, because I have a sitting job just like you, but also you have a lot of different things to handle. So I really have to decompress in the evening and in the weekend. And I think a lot of people have that. That's also what we see in our research. So we built that in because we give shape to our life like that.
I hope that the listeners enjoyed this conversation. I very much have. It has made me think a lot about what stress is, how we can relate to it. And I'm just really grateful that you were here on the show, Bertus. Thanks for coming.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. And till next time.